The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village, offering research-based arts, music, fitness, and lifelong learning programs at their assisted living and Alzheimer's care community in Westfield. armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. Good morning, I'm Carrie Saldo. Today is Friday, June 20th, 2025, the summer solstice. I am really enjoying all of this lovely daylight. And here to shine some light on this week's news, Adam Hines, the CEO of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute and former state senator from the 413, Springfield Republican newspaper reporter April May Munford, and Karen Brown, a reporter right here at NEPM. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Later in the show, the cost of basic food and housing needs continues to rise, and we will discuss impacts and what might be done to help get people some relief. And fresh off of yesterday's federal Juneteenth holiday, we'll check in on how people marked the occasion and the effects. But first, as a military parade marking the 250th anniversary of the Army was held in the nation's capital Saturday, millions across the country demonstrated against what they perceived to be the Trump administration's overreach in so-called No Kings protests. According to local reports, there were more than 100 No Kings rallies across Massachusetts Saturday. Among protest spots here in Western Massachusetts, Springfield, East Hampton, Northampton, Greenfield, Great Barrington, Dalton, Lee, and Pittsfield, to name some. Karen Brown, you reported, along with Elizabeth Roman and Phil Bishop, on some of these local protests. What did you hear from attendees?
Well, one thing that I was in Northampton mostly covering that protest, and I was just struck by how No Kings was just a very narrow part of what folks were protesting. There was certainly, it was, coincided with the military parade and with concerns that President Trump is engaging in sort of massive executive power overreach. That was the No Kings aspect. But people also talked about fears over federal cuts, over immigration raids, over women's rights, over the possibility of losing Medicaid funding in mass and what that could mean for dismantling of the healthcare system. So there was it was very wide, but it was also, it was very peaceful. It was very there was a lot of excitement and one woman I talked to there actually said her granddaughter was scared. Her 11-year-old granddaughter was scared to go because she was worried there could be violence, which of course there wasn't. And the grandmother said, well, I'll go for you. So I thought that was interesting.
Scared based on potentially what she's seeing coming out of California. It was
Exactly.
the National Guard showing up to
It was sort of a
very
generalized
different
anxiety that I think a lot of people were wondering about.
Well, we know that June 14th was the 250th anniversary of the Army, which is part of what President Trump wanted to celebrate in Washington, part of the reason he held the parade. President Trump said this at remarks at the event, quote, "Tonight we affirm an unwavering certainty that in the years ahead and in every generation hence, whenever duty calls and whatever danger comes, the American soldier will be there. No matter the risks, no matter the obstacles, our warriors will charge into battle. They will plunge into the crucible of fire, and they will seize the crown of victory because the United States of America will always have the grace of Almighty God and the iron will of the United States Army." The Berkshire Eagle wrote an editorial related to these protests, pushing back on what President Trump has been doing, and the editorial said in part, quote, "Our eyes are on the leaders who have generated significant momentum for this movement. They should be proud of that momentum and clear-eyed about the need to direct it somewhere popular and productive while it's palpable." Adam, can this movement among people who oppose what President Trump is doing and his approach make any change given the Republican control that is held currently?
Well, ultimately, this is about creating a check on the executive when people are in the streets in this way. And interestingly, I run an institute on the U.S. Senate, and people are often asking me, daily in fact, these days, well, isn't this the intention of the founders, that the Senate and Congress would provide a check on the executive power and the judiciary as well? And right now we're not seeing it. There's this founding concept, Madisonian ambition, that the senators, the members of Congress, even the judiciary to some extent, would want that power, and therefore that would motivate them to stand up in themselves. But we're also seeing the difference that there weren't political parties at the founding of our country, and they're now more deferential to political party than to even the branches that they're representing. And so it's an interesting contrast. And I think absent that, when there's a gap, it will be filled by the protests that we saw.
April, what are you keeping an eye on, watching in all of this?
So I want to highlight that this is a part of American fabric, right? The protest, this is a part of American fabric. We see a lot of change movements happen after protests. We'll be watching the leaders of, the protesters against President Trump to see how they develop, to see what momentum they have, to see what steps are actually going to be taken next to make the change that they want to see.
Karen Brown.
Well, just one observation. When I was in Northampton, the leaders of that particular protest were an 18 and a 19-year-old college student who said they just sort of signed up on the website to organize it. And they got, Jim McGovern and Lindsay Sabadosa and a lot of, prominent politicians. And I thought that countered what I've heard, that young people are not as involved as older people. And they were saying, yeah, we are.
I think if we go back to the Freedom Summer in 1964, we see them not only going down south to Mississippi to sign people up for voting rights, but they were also training micro leaders in their respective communities. And that's what helped make the change, is that they were also developing leaders while they were protesting, while they were signing people up to vote. And I think that that's going to be important moving forward.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Karen, you mentioned that you heard from protesters a wide range of concerns. And among the concerns we heard about in the news this week are the price of basic needs like food and shelter, and how it is increasingly difficult or impossible for people to afford these things. Specifically, there was reporting by Will Ketcher for Mass Live about food insecurity. Quote, more than 2 million adults across Massachusetts, representing over 1/3 of households, are unable to afford enough food or are uncertain where their next meal will come from, according to a study released Tuesday. The report paints a dire picture of the persistent problem of a significant portion of the state faces affording basic nutritional essentials. And it comes as state officials warn that Republican lawmakers' proposed cuts to federal assistance programs could throw further families' food supply into uncertainty. Specific to Western Massachusetts, Hampden County led the state in this problem. 54% of residents are food insecure, according to this report. Looking elsewhere across Western Massachusetts, Berkshire County, 39% food insecure. Franklin and Hampshire counties, the report combined those two counties, 50%. So we have among the highest rates, the highest, in fact, with the rate we're seeing in Hampden County, and quite high in those other counties in the 413. April, you're consistently reporting on communities of color, the rates of food insecurity among Hispanic individuals, according to this report, 60%, which is up persistently from pre-pandemic levels. Black residents, we saw the number go down just a bit from last year to 46%, but again, still up significantly from pre-pandemic levels. What are your thoughts as you look at this reporting in this report?
I think what comes up for me is that it's not just having access to food. It's having access to nutritional food. A little fun fact about me is I used to work at a gas station, and I seen everyone from all walks of life eating gas station food, literally chips, soda, kids with big juices. And I've seen
as their meals, as their
as
primary
their meals.
Yeah.
I've seen a construction worker, almost 45 years old, eating paydays for dinner. I had to tell him, do you know there's resources? So hunger is not a specific issue. I think what is important to highlight is that there are people who are working that are hungry. And they're working more than one job trying to make ends meet. The high taxes, tariffs, inflation is breaking the average citizen. And unfortunately, all of those cuts are going to widen this gap.
Karen, for you as a health reporter, what stood out to me in the reporting was that this is a snowballing effect, right? If you're relying on, as April was saying, a gas station to be your primary sustenance, you're putting in food that is not as nutritious as your body needs. And the report highlighted the impact that this is having on other areas of health, whether it's diabetes or high cholesterol or heart disease. What do you think as a health reporter when you see that information?
Well, it goes to the fact that our healthcare system does not have the resources to address all of these issues. I've reported a lot on primary care and how they only have 7 minutes to talk to their patients often, or even 15 minutes. So now, if you're going to be adding things like more diabetes and more issues of obesity and more issues of heart disease, that's got to come from somewhere, and we're not seeing any shoring up of the healthcare system. Not that that's where the attention should be paid. I mean, obviously, prevention is really where a lot of experts say this should be going. And if the prevention is to provide nutritious food, that seems like that's probably where a lot of resources should be going.
One of the things that I've heard Congressman Jim McGovern, who this is a huge issue for him, he said it multiple times here on the Fabulous 413 and on other interviews with our reporters, that we live in the United States of America. It is not about a lack of quantity of food. It is about a flaw in the distribution of those resources to the people who need them. And, the importance of figuring out how to get the food in the hands of folks who need it. Western Mass Food Bank is one of those organizations that is working to help people, fill the gaps. We have senior centers that also provide resources for folks, whether that's Meals on Wheels, school systems. We see so many students in Western Massachusetts on free or reduced cost lunch. April, that sparked something for you.
Yes, I think that, the cuts are going to impact children and seniors the most. They rely on this food.
Adam Hines, I was thinking more historically for you when you were a state senator. Were people coming to your office, ringing your phone call, hitting the email inbox about this issue then? And are we seeing similar problems or different problems now?
Yeah, and I like where this conversation has gone, because there was always a focus of, well, we need to focus on transportation and getting access and healthcare, and it's more than just putting food on the table. But that was a big focus of our budgets, and so the emergency food assistance (MEFAP) was always a center of the conversation. It's somewhere north of $40 million every year to get it out to the food banks and the like, and that was something that always struck me. Is you have who's qualifying for SNAP assistance. And then you can now double that for the folks who are actually the number of people showing up in food banks and needing support. And so there's a bit of a disconnect, either folks who are on the edge, they can't quite make ends meet. And so that speaks a lot to the importance of investing in our food banks and making sure there's accessibility throughout the region.
And that SNAP program you reference is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which people are using to help.
Formerly food stamps.
Formerly food stamps, right. Exactly. Well, if you're listening to this and you are someone who cannot afford their next meal, or you know someone who cannot afford their next meal, please contact the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts, and I'll give the phone number, 413-247-9738, or you can go online to foodbankwma.org. All right, we're going to take a quick break here on the Rundown. There is more to come. We still have our Rundowners' thoughts on why the cost of living is impacting seniors' ability to remain in their own homes, and what might be done about that to change it, and how communities throughout Western Mass celebrated Juneteenth. You're listening to the Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I'm Carrie Saldo. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I am Carrie Saldo in studio with journalists April May Munford and Karen Brown, and former State Senator Adam Hines, who now leads the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. Our next headline this morning, quote, "I don't have time to grieve. More seniors in the Berkshires face housing instability, homelessness." This was reporting by Claire O'Callahan for the Berkshire Eagle, quoting, It's been a year since Marlene Ethier's husband died, but she hasn't yet had time to grieve. In the months following her husband's death, the 70-year-old found herself unable to afford life on her single Social Security check. Her car was repossessed, and her home went into foreclosure. With the help of a friend who's a realtor, Ethier sold her home for just enough to pay off her debt. Then she moved into her cousin's living room. She's been sleeping on a couch for a year now. April, I saw a look on your face. What's your reaction as you hear this reporting out of the Berkshire Eagle?
Sadness.
Yeah, it's incredibly
Sadness.
incredibly sad to think about someone who is likely worked their entire life to afford a home, the American dream, right? Affording one's own home to live in, and now she was forced to sell it because a two-income household became a one-income household.
And even rentals are out of reach. It's gone beyond the American dream of owning a home. But and I thought that article was interesting in just pointing out that aging also requires additional types of accommodations. You need accessibility. Maybe you need space to have in-home care. All sorts of things that make your housing needs more complicated, not less so, when the resources to help them seem not forthcoming.
Absolutely. Claire's story pointed out that that this Marlene Ethier had one apartment come up that she thought she could move into, but then she realized there were too many steps for her to get into the apartment. So there's an apartment there that potentially she could have afforded, but then there are other complications to consider when we're looking at this. When I think about witnessing people who are in this position that Marlene Ethier talked about, and her cousin who is now in a similar situation, according to the Eagle, the cousin who she moved in with, her household recently shifted from a two-income household to a one-income household, and now her cousin who's providing housing for her potentially is also in an unstable situation and not clear if she can keep her own home. I'm thinking about these changes, whether it's the death of a spouse, the loss of a job, reduction of the amount of money you've got coming in. There are Shine healthcare workers who help elders answer questions about insurance. And I was curious, are there counselors out there for elders who work on these financial puzzle pieces? I reached out to a senior center yesterday, but it was a federal holiday, so I don't have any solid answers on it. But it's a question in the back of my head. Adam Hines, I imagine you saw elders coming into your office as a former state senator.
Absolutely, and there are services out there, Elder Services of Western Mass and Pathfinder, and there's a bunch, and we can provide those through another means. But ultimately, we're looking at, and the state looks at, what's driving the increase in costs, and it's the shortage of supply, and then the prices go up, and so solutions are different by region. I think Berkshire, reading the article about Berkshire County, it really resonates that it's going to be different in southern Berkshire County versus northern Berkshire County versus western Mass and eastern Mass. So giving folks the tools to unlock where there's potential is a big one. I love what the state did last year with a big $5 billion housing bill, trying to unlock some of those things. Can you change commercial buildings into housing units? Can you make sure there's more affordable housing on the market? Can you on and on and on, accessory dwelling units, and so I think that's where you have to go. But there's also, this article puts out there who's eligible for what and when, and what is changing, and I think that's another area we have to look at is you might be just above the cut and they still have a major problem.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight something that Adam just said, is that you can call your local senior center if this is something that you are struggling with, and maybe they won't have the answer, but they can point you in the right direction of someone who might be able to give you some answers or a little bit of support. April?
We see communities like Holyoke responding to the housing crisis, building 55-plus apartments and dwellings, and so I know there's
for age 55 plus, you mean? Yeah. So senior living communities.
Mm-hmm. So there's one right next to the police station that's going up, and it's going to be available soon.
Well, one thing that also strikes me, just the notion of community that they mention in this article, is that the older you get, the older your community gets, right? And the more needs that maybe friends that you might have relied on in the past, now they have their own challenges. I always have this, I'm in my 50s, and I always imagine, I'll just go into one of those Golden Girls situation. I'll get 3 other girlfriends, and we'll just, live together and help each other. But, again, the older you get, the more we all kind of need each other more and more. And you need outsiders. We need the 40-year-olds and the 30-year-olds to be helping out.
And we see in other cultures, intergenerational housing situations are more common. And I think in America, we have this kind of idea that this self-reliance and we live on our own. And that's kind of complicating things in certain lights. April?
Yeah, and then elderly people need a little bit more assistance. Like, for instance, my grandmother has Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. And so filling out paperwork, remembering when to pay bills, remembering when she took her medication, all of those things take time and it take effort and other people to do. And then I worry about elderly people who are here by themselves and who are isolated, who don't have people to help them fill out these applications, go to these appointments, and look for a place to live.
I think that's where you step up as a neighbor, right? That's where you step up as a friend, just keeping in mind people who could use help, and also like how wonderful it is to have those folks in your life. I mean, Adam, when you said the shortage piece, we're looking at potentially 220,000 housing units that Massachusetts thinks it is going to be short in the coming years. From the Wild Ideas Department, right? We have elders who can't afford the home that they're living in. We have young people who we know aren't moving to Massachusetts because they're worried they won't be able to afford housing. Like, is there a meeting of the minds that we could have here where there's some intergenerational living, cohabitation potentially, where the elder has a younger person in their life, the younger person has housing they can afford? It's just something that's on my mind. And if it works for folks, that would be wonderful. And if it doesn't, you can email me the rundown at npm.org.
Yeah.
Check out Treehouse in East Hampton. I believe that's part of their model.
Right. It's something that's done in other places, for sure. I think it might be a fun solution for some folks, not available to all, perhaps, but some. We saw Juneteenth marked yesterday, Thursday. The fourth year, Juneteenth has been a federal holiday. Massachusetts was a few years ahead of the curve. It's been a state holiday since 2020. We saw Governor Deval Patrick tap it as not as a state holiday, but as a commemoration earlier before that. And while government recognition of the holiday was later than some people would have liked, it is fitting because, as Jill Kaufman pointed out in her reporting for NEPM, quote, families from around Western Massachusetts have an historic and personal connection to the Civil War and Juneteenth, dating back to June 19th, 1865. On that day, the all-black Massachusetts 54th Regiment were among the U.S. Army troops that arrived in Galveston, Texas, to inform some of the last enslaved Americans they were free. That regiment included residents from Amherst and Pittsfield who were celebrated posthumously at ceremonies in our region on Sunday. April, what does this holiday, Juneteenth, mean for you, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, Juneteenth. So first, I used to cross off the calendar every year and write Happy Juneteenth, and I don't have to do that anymore, and that feels good. But what I've seen is that people are marking the holiday by using their voice to speak up against injustices, because you can't be free if there's injustice. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so we see all of these protests, these No King protests, and this was another way for people to celebrate and to also use their voice to call for the justice that we still are seeking.
Yeah, and one of the stories that you profiled, it was about the Afro-Caribbean Heritage Festival, Juneteenth celebration that we saw last weekend. I was struck by something one of the co-organizers said, Gloria Caballero Roca, and she talked about interdependence, right? How we're all living and with each other and reliant on each other, and how especially important it is in today's society when diversity is under attack. That's something she talked about in your reporting. And Adam, I was thinking about that as it relates to politics, because we always talk about bipartisanship in politics, right? Like the idea that people from two different idea camps are going to come together for the betterment of our society. But should we be thinking more about interconnectedness?
Zero question. Obviously, this is American history. It's African American history, but it's American history. And I loved the kind of the framing of Kelly Carter Jackson out of Wellesley, who said we should think about it in terms of dreams, delays, delight, and it's the holiday itself has gone through that. We heard, it was celebrated the year after liberation in Galveston, and then it wasn't until the 80s that Texas made it an official holiday, and then you captured after that. And so being aware of the evolution and doing that together is a central part of the holiday.
And I think she brings that to perspective when she talks about how art can create that interdependence with everyone. Some of the dances and the drums is a call and response. And this is traditional dance music and drums. And so by inviting people to participate in these workshops, by inviting people to use their voice and to speak, it also creates that interconnectedness. It creates that diversity that our ancestors had, championed so well.
Karen Brown.
And I actually went to a very interesting event for Juneteenth. It was performer Jake Blunt, who was performing at historic Deerfield. And one of the things he does as a musician is he tries to preserve African-American folk music. And he talked a lot about how original Black music had been usurped by white singers. And I thought that was an important piece of history, especially at historic Deerfield, which I thought was an interesting place for his concert. But he also very easily transitioned to, we need to talk about what's going on now with current events and what is happening to the rights of people who are historically marginalized, that things have not changed as much as one would hope.
I think she points out that, having cuts to certain programs in school kind of create this gap where people aren't sharing anymore, and people can't share their cultural history, and they can't share it through art. And so, having a place in the community to share that together and to also invite other people, because they, of course, invited the entire Western mass, and they hope to continue to do that. It just creates that diversity that we need.
Yeah, and a cultural connectedness, right? An
Correct.
awareness of a culture that might not be the first culture that I was raised in, but an awareness and the way that enriches all of our lives because we have access to that.
Absolutely.
April, I just want to ask you briefly about a different story you reported on this week. You spoke with Holyoke's chief of police, who's been in the post for 6 months now, Chief Brian Keenan, and he pointed to his use of the broken windows theory, but a kind of an updated version of it, where he's saying it's a more compassionate version of that with this idea, because it was a sometimes controversial approach, this idea of, any police infraction is something that needs attention. What did you hear from Chief Keenan?
Well, so he's been trying to focus on, or he has been focusing on, cracking down and returning the parks to citizens and children. Having one broken window or having graffiti or blight or open air drug dealing or prostitution leads to bigger crimes if the bad actors feel like there's no consequences for the smaller things. So he's trying to clean up the parks and make it uncomfortable for the bad actors to, do those things in the park. He says that, kids and people shouldn't have to walk across needles or see prostitution when they're walking to school or to the grocery store. And so that's really what's important. He also believes that communities get what they tolerate. And if it's not being tolerated in Long Meadow, then it shouldn't be tolerated in Holyoke.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point that he made. If it's not allowed in Wilbraham or Long Meadow, it shouldn't be allowed or tolerated in Holyoke. All right, we're going to do a lightning round here of scoops, praise, and prediction with my team. What is on the minds of folks today? Not a scoop for you, Adam Hines, I imagine. You're not reporting, but a praise or prediction you have about the news?
Well, look, one thing that's been on my mind is the murder of the state representative in Minnesota, Melissa Hortman, and I've spent most of my career overseas and dealing with civil wars and conflicts, and it's very scary when you start to see assassinations. And so my praise is for the elected officials who very quickly came out and said, nope, too much political violence is not acceptable.
Yeah. April, how about for you?
So I just want people to take a look at the West Springfield mayoral campaign. We have Town Councilor Daniel O'Brien, who's running against incumbent William Reichout. What's on the table is budget, keeping neighborhood schools, and a new police station.
Karen Brown, we're going to leave it for another day. I'm going to have people keep their eyes out for new reporting from Karen Brown coming up. You've been listening to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. Happy belated Father's Day to everybody out there, including my dad.